The sweltering summer of 1,839 inches Louisiana had already claimed the patience of men, but none had imagined the endurance of one young woman named Mira. Her skin, marked with the faint traces of previous lashings, carried the resilience of a soul that refused to break. Known among the enslaved for her quiet intelligence and unflinching gaze, Mira had learned long ago that survival was not just about flesh, but about mind, heart, and cunning. On the McAllister plantation, she was often the target of cruel whims. The overseer, a man named Hawthorne, had recently devised a new method of punishment. He called it the hell chest, a small iron-bound chest barely large enough to hold a grown woman, sealed with a heavy padlock, and left under the blistering sun for hours or days. Any complaint from the enslaved about heat, hunger, or thirst was met with laughter from Hawthorne, a man who believed cruelty measured strength. Mira, however, had something Hawthorne had not accounted for, a mind sharp enough to outwit cruelty and a will stronger than iron itself. It began with a storm of rage that Mira had not seen coming. The mistress had found the embroidery she had been stitching for weeks spoiled an accident, not sabotage, and blamed Mira for it. Hawthorne, eager to demonstrate his authority, dragged Mira to the small clearing near the stables where the hell chest sat waiting. Its black iron surface gleamed ominously under the morning sun, the padlock dangling like a watchful eye. "You'll learn respect here," Hawthorne barked, shoving Mira toward the chest. She stumbled slightly but caught herself, her hands brushing the metal as she glared back at him. Fear had no place in her eyes. Defiance did. Hawthorne shoved her inside, and the chest's iron walls closed tightly around her. The smell of iron, dust, and old straw enveloped her. It was dark, stifling, and nearly suffocating, but Mira had anticipated this. She bent her knees, folded herself carefully, and concentrated on her breathing. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the metal began to heat. Hawthorne leaned against the chest, taunting her. "How long can you last, girl?" He sneered, confident in the suffering he had designed. But Mira had endured worse months of hunger, lashings, and the constant threat of death had taught her the measure of pain and how to navigate it. She focused her mind elsewhere. She thought of her mother, who had survived similar cruelty and taught her that cunning could be stronger than muscle. She counted the slats of sunlight that managed to filter through the tiny gaps in the iron. She imagined the river, the wind in the cypress trees, and the soft laughter of children playing far away. By anchoring her mind to memory and hope, Mira insulated herself against the suffocating walls. When Hawthorne came back to check hours later, he expected a broken, desperate girl. Instead, he heard calm, even humming. Mira's voice, though faint, carried a melody she had learned from her mother, a song of defiance, of survival, of promise that cruelty could not extinguish. Hawthorne's confidence wavered for the first time. The chest had been designed to break her, but Mira remained intact, mentally and emotionally. Each passing hour was a testament to her endurance, each beat of her heart a silent rebellion. And in that chest, in that dark, suffocating tomb of iron, Mira began plotting more than her survival. She began plotting her revenge. By the first night, she had memorized every creak of the chest, every shift of the padlock, every sound from the outside. She knew the weaknesses, the rhythm, and the opportunities. Hawthorne, intoxicated by his own cruelty, had underestimated the one thing that no iron could contain, a mind determined to outlive its oppressor. The first day ended. Mira had survived the chest, and in surviving, she had planted the seed of fear in the man who believed fear was his dominion. She was no longer just a victim, she was a strategist, a survivor, and a storm waiting for the right moment to strike. And the storm would not wait long. The next morning, the sun rose over the McAllister plantation, casting long shadows across the red clay and the swaying cane fields. Hawthorne strutted through the yard with the confidence of a man certain of his authority. Yet a subtle unease clung to him like a second skin. He could not explain it, but the memory of Mira's calm humming in the chest haunted him. Even the crows seemed to pause before him. their calls sharp and accusing. Inside the quarters, Mira flexed her hands and toes, stretching out the stiffness from the long hours in the iron chest. She had survived the night, but survival alone was no longer enough. Her mind raced, mapping out every step she might take, every flaw in the overseer's arrogance. She had learned that patience could be a weapon, sharper than any lash. Mira's small body carried no weapons, yet her mind had already begun the work of dismantling Hawthorne's pride and planning his undoing. Her fellow enslaved whispered in the corners of the cabin. Word had spread of the hell chest, and everyone spoke in hushed tones of Mira's endurance. Even those too afraid to confront Hawthorne felt the shift in the air, the quiet tremor of defiance. Some dared to peek at her, nodding in reverence at the woman who had survived a punishment no one else had dared endure. Mira did not boast. She simply returned their glances with steady eyes, letting them feel hope without her needing to speak it aloud. By midday, Hawthorne returned to inspect his creation. He approached the chest with a mix of curiosity and irritation, expecting perhaps to find a broken girl, slumped and silent. But when he reached the chest and rattled the padlock, he found Mira seated upright, her hair slightly disheveled, yet her gaze calm and unwavering. "You should be on your knees begging," Hawthorne spat, stepping closer. "Instead, you look defiant. Do you not feel your punishment?" Mira did not flinch. She let the silence stretch between them before answering softly, each word deliberate. "Punishment cannot touch what is inside my mind," she said. "You may close the chest, you may lock it, but you cannot command my thoughts." Hawthorne's face darkened. He had expected fear, perhaps tears. Instead, Mira had revealed something far more dangerous. She had shown control over herself, and in doing so, exposed a weakness in his power. A man used to bending wills with threats and iron found himself confronted by a resilience he had never encountered. By the afternoon, she returned to the chest willingly, not as a prisoner, but as an opportunity. Hawthorne, eager to prove his dominance, had grown careless. Mira noted the hinges, the slight warp in the iron, the way the padlock's teeth clicked when turned. She memorized every detail, the sound of approaching boots, the angle of the sun that made the metal unbearably hot. Every observation became part of a plan that had only just begun to take shape. That evening, as the other enslaved huddled near the hearth, Mira whispered instructions to those she trusted. She spoke in coded words, using the simplest actions as signals. One movement, one gesture, could relay hours of preparation and intent. In this network of quiet communication, Mira found allies and shared her vision, not merely to survive, but to overturn the cruelty that had ruled their lives for too long. The night came again, and with it, the chest. Hawthorne was convinced that another day in iron would break her, but Mira welcomed it as a chance to observe, to reflect, and to prepare. She had learned to control her pulse, to regulate her breathing, to make the chest almost feel like a sanctuary. Inside, in the suffocating darkness, she rehearsed her next moves, envisioning them like a chessboard, with Hawthorne and the other overseers as pieces to be anticipated and outmaneuvered. By the end of the second day, one truth had solidified in her mind. The chest was no longer a tool of punishment, it was a classroom, a laboratory for strategy. Each day she endured brought her closer to understanding the rhythm of the plantation, the weaknesses of her oppressors, and the strength of her own resolve. And while Hawthorne believed himself to be teaching her fear, Mira had learned patience, observation, and foresight, the true weapons she would wield when the time came. As the moon rose over the quiet quarters, Mira felt a flicker of satisfaction. The iron could hold her body, but it could not contain her spirit. The night whispered promises of change, and Mira listened, sharpening her mind and her resolve, knowing that each passing hour brought her closer to the moment when she would no longer simply endure, but act. Morning came slowly over the McAllister plantation. The sun's first light draped the fields in a golden haze, casting long shadows that stretched across the red clay. Hawthorne, satisfied with his control, patrolled the yard with his usual air of superiority. He glanced at the chest where Mira had spent the night, convinced that her will would soon bend beneath its iron weight. What he did not realize was that each hour inside the chest had made her sharper, more aware, and far more determined than the man who fancied himself omnipotent. Mira stepped out of the chest as the padlock clicked open. Her arms were stiff, but her posture was unbroken, her eyes steady and alert. She had learned to move quietly, to conserve energy, and to observe every small detail in her surroundings. Hawthorne's arrogance gave her openings. The gaps in his oversight became opportunities. She noted the way he favored certain corners of the yard, the path he always walked while making his rounds, and the times he glanced away, distracted by the trivialities of authority. Inside the quarters, whispers followed Mira wherever she went. The other enslaved watched her carefully, drawn to her calm confidence and the aura of intelligence she radiated. Some had begun to understand that her endurance was more than physical, it was strategic. In hushed voices, they discussed small tasks she assigned, bringing her water without attracting Hawthorne's notice, observing the overseers for signs of carelessness, and noting when the master's attention wavered. By midday, Hawthorne approached, brimming with irritation. He expected fear, perhaps tears, but Mira met his gaze with quiet resolve. "You may lock the chest again," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "But my thoughts remain mine." The words were simple, but they carried a weight Hawthorne could not measure. They were the first cracks in his assumption that control resided solely in the iron and in his whip. Hawthorne, frustrated by her composure, forced her back into the chest later that afternoon. He had grown careless in his confidence, assuming she would crumble quickly. Inside the suffocating space, Mira allowed herself a moment of reflection. She could feel the heat of the iron pressing against her, yet her mind was cool and deliberate. Each creak of the wood, each scrape of the hinges, each distant sound in the yard was catalogued and remembered. Mira had transformed the chest from an instrument of punishment into a tool for gathering intelligence. While Hawthorne believed the chest was breaking her, Mira was mapping her path to freedom, or at least to a subtle form of retribution. She studied the patterns of the overseers, when they walked in pairs, when they spoke too loudly, and when they left their positions unattended. Each observation became a part of her mental strategy, a way to gain leverage without relying on force. That evening, she whispered instructions to a few trusted companions. Her network within the quarters was growing, bound by mutual respect and careful planning. She shared signals, subtle cues that would allow them to communicate silently during her continued punishments. Her calm demeanor inspired a cautious hope. If Mira could endure the chest, perhaps they too could find ways to resist the daily cruelties that defined their lives. By nightfall, Mira was once again returned to the chest. But she welcomed it. The dark, confined space was no longer a place of despair. It was a training ground for her mind, a silent chamber where she could envision and rehearse her moves. She thought of each overseer, each routine, each weakness that might be exploited. She imagined the day when she would turn the tables, not through brute force, but through patience, intelligence, and careful observation. As the hours passed, Mira discovered a rhythm in the chest, a way to remain alert without revealing it, a method to hear every sound without giving away her own presence. She counted steps, measured time, and memorized the sequence of noises that traveled across the yard. Every night in the iron chest became a lesson in vigilance and planning. When dawn finally approached, Mira emerged with the same calm confidence she had maintained for 3 days. Hawthorne, convinced of her impending collapse, remained oblivious to the truth. She was no longer a mere captive. She was a strategist, a thinker, and a woman building the foundation for the day she would reclaim power in ways he could never anticipate. By the morning light, the other enslaved noticed her composure and resilience, and a quiet determination began to spread among them. The chest, meant to instill fear, had instead become a symbol of endurance, cunning, and hope. Mira's silent victories inside that iron box had begun to ripple outward, touching everyone who dared to look closely. Hawthorne, still confident in his authority, remained blind to the shift in the air, unaware that every misstep he made was catalogued, studied, and filed away in a mind far sharper than his own. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Mira emerged from the chest, her body aching but her mind razor-sharp. She moved silently through the quarters, aware that every glance from the other enslaved held a question. What had she learned? What had she survived? And what would she do next? Mira's calm composure had become a language in itself, one her companions were beginning to understand intuitively. Hawthorne, confident in the routine, had allowed her a rare walk in the yard under his supervision. It was a calculated arrogance. He believed the chest had broken her, that each day of confinement had eroded her spirit. But Mira had learned patience in darkness, and patience was a far more dangerous weapon than brute strength. She noted every detail of the yard, the placement of tools, the movement of the overseers, and the creaking spots in the fence where a slight pressure could yield a gap. Inside the quarters, Mira quietly shared her observations with a few trusted allies. Her companions were careful not to speak too loudly. Every word had to be measured, every glance intentional. She was building a network of awareness, a web of subtle resistance. Tasks were divided discreetly. Someone would watch the kitchen, another the stables, and others would note the comings and goings of the master and overseers. Each detail mattered. Each moment of vigilance was a step toward control. Hawthorne, oblivious to the web forming around him, conducted his inspections with an air of triumph. He watched Mira move gracefully among the others, convinced that her spirit was diminished. She bore no sign of fear, no tremor, no sign that she had endured 3 days in the chest. The reality was that Mira's mind had grown sharper, more alert, more attuned to the rhythms of the plantation. Every casual glance from Hawthorne, every flicker of attention, was catalogued in her memory. That afternoon, Mira was sent back to the chest, a punishment for a trivial misstep that had been noticed by one of the overseers. She entered without resistance, her breathing steady, her mind focused. Inside, she closed her eyes and began a careful survey of the sounds around her. The distant clatter of the barn, the soft whistle of wind through the trees, and the irregular steps of the guards, each was a signal, each a piece of the puzzle she was slowly assembling. As the hours passed, Mira found a rhythm within the chest. She could feel the movements of the men above her, anticipate their patterns, and mentally map the yard and quarters as if the chest itself were an elevated vantage point. This was no longer a place of torment. It was a chamber of strategy, a silent observatory where she could plan and adapt without revealing herself. Her endurance was transforming into foresight. The enslaved outside began to notice subtle changes. Food appeared where it had not before. Water was delivered more efficiently, and small favors were exchanged discreetly. They began to understand that Mira's resilience was not simply survival, it was action disguised as submission. Her influence began to ripple outward, quiet but undeniable, shaping the small, vital movements of the plantation. By the 4th night, Mira could anticipate the master's and overseer's behaviors with unnerving accuracy. She predicted the moments they would grow careless, when they would separate, and when they would ignore minor disturbances. This knowledge was power, a silent leverage she could wield without ever leaving the chest. Every day of confinement had honed her awareness, making the iron box less a prison and more a classroom of human observation and tactical patience. Hawthorne, in his hubris, remained blind. He continued to assume her spirit would eventually break, unaware that his actions were teaching her exactly how to respond. Mira knew the exact location of each tool, the timings of each shift, and the vulnerabilities in the chain of command that kept the plantation running. Her plan was slow, deliberate, and invisible. She was creating conditions where one carefully orchestrated move could tip the balance, where the weak would become strong, and the oppressed would reclaim their power. Night descended again, and Mira closed her eyes in the chest, feeling the cold iron and the suffocating walls as she had grown accustomed to. Instead of despair, she felt focus. Instead of fear, she felt strategy. Every sound, every creak, every shadow outside became a point of data. Each day of endurance had sharpened her perception, preparing her for the moment when the chest would no longer contain her and when her observations would become action. By the first light of dawn, Mira emerged with the same calm determination, her mind a map of the plantation, her plan expanding quietly with each breath. The other enslaved watched with reverent awe. The chest had not broken her, it had made her something beyond fear. She was patient, she was observant, and she was ready. Hawthorne, still confident, had no inkling that the next steps Mira took would begin to rewrite the rules of the yard he thought he controlled so completely. The dawn air was cool and still, carrying the soft hum of early labor across the plantation. Mira stepped from the chest with quiet confidence, her body still carrying the stiffness of confinement, but her mind alert and sharp. Today, the plan she had been shaping in the iron box would begin to take form not through open rebellion, but through the subtle, precise orchestration of events she could control. She moved among the enslaved, exchanging nods and careful gestures. Each person knew their role, but none fully understood the depth of Mira's strategy. That was intentional. They were instruments, but the conductor was unseen. She whispered directions quietly, assigning small tasks that seemed ordinary moving supplies, reporting on the master's schedule, observing the overseers, but each action built the scaffolding for the greater plan. Hawthorne, as always, underestimated her. He watched her with a mixture of amusement and disdain, convinced her time in the chest had left her fragile and fearful. He had no awareness that her calm demeanor was a mask, a tool, and that every movement he observed was catalogued and memorized. He checked the fences, adjusted the gates, and moved about the yard with the assurance of a man who believed he had complete control. Mira noted every lapse, every shift of attention, and every pattern in his movements. The day passed with a rhythm of work and quiet observation. Mira moved through the quarters, the kitchen, and the barns, carefully measuring distances, noting hidden paths, and understanding how the tools and resources could be redirected. Small interventions began to take shape. A water bucket slightly misplaced, a rope subtly frayed, a tool left in an unexpected location, all minor adjustments that, over time, would shape the environment to her advantage. By mid-afternoon, Mira had reached the stables. The horses moved restlessly under the overseer's inattentive gaze. She bent to secure a gate, her hands moving deftly, and noticed a loose latch, a vulnerability in the perimeter that, if leveraged, could allow movement without immediate detection. She mentally stored the position, imagining the sequence of actions required to exploit it later. This was not chaos. It was a controlled experiment in observation, patience, and timing. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread among the enslaved. Small but noticeable changes in their environment sparked a growing confidence. Mira's influence was subtle but undeniable. They began to trust in her presence, noting that she seemed to sense dangers before they arrived, to know the patterns of the overseers, and to anticipate the master's whims. Fear gave way to a cautious optimism. Even the youngest among them seemed to walk taller, inspired by her resilience. Hawthorne, blinded by his own ego, continued to conduct inspections, failing to notice the shifts under his nose. Mira noted which workers were most observant, which ones could be relied upon to execute subtle instructions, and who needed gentle guidance. By evening, she had built a silent network of communication, a lattice of influence that spread across the plantation without ever revealing itself openly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mira gathered the few closest to her in a secluded corner of the yard. Her voice was low but firm. "Tomorrow," she said, "we begin testing the first moves. Nothing obvious, nothing risky. We watch, we learn, and we prepare. Patience will be our ally." The others nodded, understanding that the real power lay not in open defiance, but in strategy and timing. Night fell, and Mira returned to the chest. Inside, she allowed herself a brief moment to stretch and breathe deeply. The iron walls that had once confined her now felt like a chamber of preparation. She reviewed the day in her mind, noting every detail, every reaction, every subtle shift in the dynamics of the yard. Each observation was a thread in a tapestry that she was weaving, and she knew that when the moment came, the tapestry would unfold into action that no one could ignore. Hours passed in the quiet darkness. Mira's mind remained active, replaying sequences of the day, adjusting mental plans, and anticipating the master's responses. Every sound from outside the creak of a gate, the murmur of voices, the distant call of an animal was data. Every detail became part of the pattern she was building. This was no longer mere survival. It was the calculated preparation for change. By the first light of the following day, Mira emerged again, her presence commanding yet discreet. Her allies looked to her not only for guidance but for hope. She smiled softly, not for herself, but for the realization that their patience, endurance, and careful observation had begun to shift the balance. The plantation, so long ruled by fear and oppression, was entering a period of subtle but undeniable change, and Mira was at the center of it. Hawthorne still believed he controlled everything. He did not yet see that control had already begun to slip, not through violence, but through intelligence, patience, and the unyielding will of one enslaved woman who had turned her suffering into strategy. The day stretched ahead, and Mira moved with calm precision, setting the first pieces of her carefully constructed plan into motion. Every glance, every gesture, every small act would ripple outward. By the end of the week, she knew, nothing would ever be quite the same on the plantation again. The morning broke with a muted golden light, filtering softly through the tall trees at the edge of the plantation. Mira emerged from the chest as usual, her movements measured and calm, the stiffness of confinement now tempered by strength and purpose. Today would be different today. The preparation she had meticulously crafted would begin to take shape in subtle, precise actions. The first task was observation. Mira moved among the workers with quiet confidence, offering a nod here, a whispered instruction there. The enslaved began to act with small autonomy, guided by her cues but unaware of the full scope of her plan. Each person became a part of the intricate design she had developed over weeks of patient assessment. Her knowledge of routines, schedules, and human tendencies was vast, and she had learned to read each overseer and worker like an open book. Hawthorne, the master, still moved through the plantation with his usual arrogance, oblivious to the shifts beneath his gaze. Mira had learned which of his men were careless, which were easily influenced, and which would follow instructions without question. She had spent the previous days planting small suggestions, creating minor disturbances that seemed coincidental but were carefully orchestrated. A misplaced tool here, a spilled bucket there. These minor disruptions had already begun to erode the illusion of order he believed he maintained. By mid-morning, Mira approached the stables. She examined the layout quietly, noting the movement of the horses and the attention of the overseers. A gate had been left slightly ajar, a vulnerability she had observed earlier. Now it could be used to facilitate movement without drawing attention. Mira instructed 2 trusted workers to adjust the stalls under the guise of routine maintenance, while she mentally rehearsed the sequence that would allow them to use the opening later in the day. Across the yard, she observed the other enslaved. Mira had taken care to identify who could be relied upon for the first steps of her plan. She whispered precise instructions, assigning small but critical roles. Every action was designed to appear mundane, while subtly preparing the environment for the larger strategy. Confidence was spreading among her allies. They moved with purpose, inspired by her calm authority, and began to notice how their own actions could shape outcomes. Hawthorne inspected the quarters as usual, counting heads and checking tools. He did not notice that the subtle adjustments Mira had made over the past week were already changing the rhythm of the plantation. She had observed his reactions and adapted her instructions to maximize disruption without drawing direct attention. By controlling the smallest details, Mira was beginning to bend the environment to her will. As the day progressed, Mira coordinated several small maneuvers. A water bucket was carefully tipped to create a diversion. A rope was moved into position, ready to facilitate quiet, controlled access. These minor actions, while appearing accidental, were deliberate steps toward the larger goal. Mira watched closely, noting the reactions of both the enslaved and the overseers, adjusting her plan as needed. By afternoon, Mira gathered her closest allies in a secluded corner. Her voice was calm but firm. "Every step counts," she said. "Patience and precision will protect us. Observe carefully, act subtly, and trust in what we have prepared. Nothing must be rushed. When the right moment comes, we will move together, and the plantation will no longer be as it has been." The others nodded, understanding that this was not a call for immediate action, but the beginning of a coordinated effort. As evening approached, Mira returned to the chest to review the day's observations. She noted every reaction, every detail, and every slight vulnerability. Her mind worked like a machine, cataloging the shifts in attention, the subtle movements, and the patterns of oversight. What had once been a prison had become a strategic vantage point, and every hour spent within its walls had honed her understanding of control, patience, and timing. Night fell. The plantation was quiet, but Mira's mind was alive with possibilities. Tomorrow, the first visible effects of her careful orchestration would begin to appear. She did not anticipate chaos. She anticipated a shift, a small, undeniable change in the balance of power. By manipulating the environment, guiding her allies, and remaining unseen, Mira had created a foundation that would allow the seeds of transformation to take root. Hawthorne, confident in his authority, still believed he controlled everything. He did not yet realize that control had already begun to slip, not through overt rebellion, but through the patience, intelligence, and unyielding resolve of a woman who had turned suffering into strategy. Mira closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself, and knew that tomorrow would be the first day the plantation began to bend to her careful design. The chest, once a symbol of confinement, had become a place of preparation, reflection, and planning, and Mira, the heart of it all, was ready. The dawn broke slowly, pale light stretching across the plantation. Mira stepped from the chest as silently as ever, feeling the morning air press against her skin. Today was the day the first phase of her plan would be set into motion. Weeks of observation, of subtle influence, of careful instruction, had led to this moment. Every action, every whispered command, had been deliberate, and now it would start to bear fruit. She moved among the workers quietly, giving a nod here, a soft word there. Those who had been carefully chosen as her closest allies responded instinctively, understanding the meaning behind the small gestures. The plantation still functioned under the illusion of normalcy, but the threads of change were beginning to weave themselves beneath the surface. Hawthorne, as usual, began his morning rounds, inspecting the quarters and checking the fences. Mira observed him from the shadows, noting his pattern, his pauses, the casual arrogance with which he assumed control. She had memorized the sequence of his steps, the times he lingered too long, the moments when his attention was elsewhere. Each of these small observations would prove critical. The first act was subtle but effective. Mira instructed one of her allies to misplace a key set of tools, a minor disruption that would seem accidental but force the overseers to divert their attention. Another ally spilled a bucket of water, sending a small ripple of surprise through the courtyard. The chaos was minor, almost imperceptible, but it tested the responses of those in authority. Mira watched closely, adjusting instructions with almost invisible signals, an eyebrow, a hand gesture, a nod, ensuring every piece of her plan moved with precision. By mid-morning, she began moving in her own controlled ways. The chest had become more than a hiding place. It was a vantage point. Mira had studied every corner of the plantation, every movement, every routine. Today, she would use that knowledge to subtly shift the dynamics. Workers were guided to rearrange supplies, creating pathways that would later facilitate larger maneuvers. Gates were left slightly open, items slightly out of place, all under the guise of ordinary labor. Hawthorne's men began to notice the minor disturbances. Frustration crept into their demeanor. They attributed it to laziness or carelessness, unaware that every small misstep had been orchestrated. Mira stayed back, invisible yet present, carefully watching each reaction. The plantation was responding to her influence without knowing it. Each minute was another reinforcement of her authority, another step toward the outcome she had envisioned. As the sun climbed higher, Mira gathered her closest allies for a short, quiet meeting. Their eyes met hers, filled with understanding and trust. "Today we begin," she whispered. "No sudden moves, no overt acts. Observe, adjust, and act only when necessary." The first cracks in their control must appear like accidents, but the foundation of change is already set. "We will move together, but slowly, deliberately. Let them see the patterns without seeing the hand that guides them." Her instructions were precise, yet encouraging. She reminded them that patience was a weapon as powerful as any other, and that intelligence and timing would overcome brute force. They nodded, their small gestures echoing the confidence Mira had instilled in them. Each person understood the value of subtlety, the power of influence over confrontation. By afternoon, small events began to unfold. A misplaced crate forced an overseer to climb a ladder awkwardly, causing a minor stumble that drew the attention of others. A horse bolted briefly, guided by a carefully removed tether, creating a brief moment of distraction. Each incident, controlled and intentional, served to chip away at the illusion of absolute authority. Mira stayed back, unseen, watching the dominoes begin to fall. Evening approached, and Mira returned to the chest to review the day in her mind. Every reaction, every movement had been catalogued, analyzed, and adjusted. The plantation had begun to shift not with sudden violence, but with controlled, deliberate influence. Hawthorne remained unaware that the threads of control he believed were his had already begun to unravel. Mira closed her eyes for a moment, letting the day's tension dissolve into quiet satisfaction. Patience, observation, and meticulous planning had set the stage. Tomorrow, the next phase would continue, small actions accumulating into undeniable change. The chest, once a prison, had become a command center, and Mira, at its heart, had turned survival into strategy. Night fell. The plantation seemed calm, yet beneath the surface, the balance of power had begun to tilt. Mira lay within the chest, her mind alive with possibilities, knowing that each carefully measured step brought them closer to the freedom she sought not just for herself, but for everyone who had learned to trust her guidance. The first rays of dawn stretched across the plantation, gilding the edges of the fences and illuminating the fields with a soft glow. Mira emerged from the chest, feeling the cool air on her skin and the weight of anticipation on her shoulders. Today would mark the beginning of the next phase where subtlety would transition into visible influence. Weeks of preparation had led to this moment. She moved silently among the quarters, checking on her allies. Each one was positioned precisely, ready to act according to the carefully laid plans she had set. No word was spoken, only small gestures and nods of understanding. The plantation still appeared to function under normal routines, but the undercurrent of change had grown strong and unignorable. Hawthorne appeared before the fields shortly after sunrise, clipboard in hand, inspecting the workers and the equipment. He seemed confident, unaware of how precariously the balance of control had begun to shift. Mira watched him from a distance, noting every pause, every hesitant glance he cast at the workers. She had already predicted his pattern, and now the first overt manipulations could be set in motion. The first act was minor, a deliberate misalignment of the water troughs in the stables. To any observer, it seemed accidental, a result of carelessness. But the effects were immediate. Workers had to adjust, shifting focus from routine tasks to correcting the small error. Hawthorne's attention was divided, and he began to scowl in mild irritation, believing the fault lay in the supposed incompetence of the laborers. Mira's allies moved like shadows, creating additional small disturbances. A tool misplaced here, a bundle of linen slightly misfolded there. Each disruption was calculated, designed to draw attention away from Mira's ultimate objective, while subtly undermining the overseer's sense of control. Even the smallest error had a ripple effect, as the overseer's attempts to regain order exposed flaws in their system. By mid-morning, Mira herself began to intervene more directly, though still without drawing notice. She guided a worker to repair a fence post in a way that appeared routine but subtly altered the layout of the field paths. Gates were left slightly ajar in areas that would later allow the workers to move more freely without interference. Every minor adjustment built toward a larger goal, the gradual dismantling of strict oversight, the cultivation of confidence and autonomy among the laborers. Hawthorne's frustration grew with each passing hour. The small disruptions, which seemed isolated to him, began to form a pattern he could not understand. Mira observed from her vantage points, noting each reaction, each attempt to assert authority, and adjusting her instructions accordingly. Her influence spread quietly, like a current beneath the surface, unseen but undeniable. By afternoon, the plantation's rhythm had subtly shifted. Workers moved with more independence, guided by Mira's discreet signals. She remained hidden in plain sight, invisible yet central to every motion. The overseers, unaware of the orchestration behind these events, became increasingly unsettled. Their commands were followed, yes, but with hesitation, small errors, and delays, all part of Mira's calculated design. Mira paused at the edge of the main courtyard, observing Hawthorne as he barked orders to correct minor mistakes. She allowed herself a quiet smile. The first visible cracks had begun to appear in the facade of control. Nothing had yet reached confrontation. Nothing had yet escalated to chaos. But the foundation of authority was shifting, and each misstep by the overseers strengthened her position. As evening approached, Mira gathered her closest allies for a brief council. "We are moving now into the stage where they will notice," she said softly, her eyes scanning each face. "Our actions will no longer be invisible. The key is to remain deliberate. Every mistake we exploit must appear natural. Every opportunity must be used, but never forced. Patience and precision will carry us further than force alone." The workers nodded, their trust in her unwavering. They had learned to move with her rhythm, to follow her cues even in silence. And Mira, feeling the momentum of her plan, allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Weeks of planning, months of observation, had led to this moment when the plantation's power structure could finally begin to bend, ever so slightly, to her guidance. Night fell. The plantation seemed calm, but beneath the surface, the currents of change had grown strong. Mira returned to the chest for the night, her mind already calculating the next day's moves. Every detail mattered: the placement of a tool, the timing of a signal, the smallest shift in routine. By controlling these elements, she could guide the course of the plantation without direct confrontation. For the first time in weeks, Mira allowed herself to imagine the larger picture. A plantation where she and those she guided moved with agency, where the overseer's power was tempered by careful influence, and where her ultimate goal, freedom and safety for herself and her allies, was within reach. The chest, once a prison, had become a command center, and Mira, as always, remained at its heart, unseen, yet in full control. The plantation had changed in ways no outsider could have immediately understood. To the casual observer, it still functioned with its routine drills, its fields tilled, its buildings in order. But beneath the surface, a quiet revolution had taken hold, one invisible to those who had believed themselves to hold power. Mira's influence had rippled through every corner of the estate, subtle but unrelenting, altering behaviors, instilling confidence, and creating bonds of trust and understanding among those who had once been mere cogs in a machine of oppression. By the time the first frost of winter settled across the fields, Mira had fully emerged from the chest for good. She no longer moved in shadows, no longer relied solely on secrecy. Her presence, once suppressed and feared, had become a force that guided the plantation's rhythm. The overseer's authority, once absolute, was tempered now by the awareness of the workers' cohesion and quiet autonomy. Small acts of defiance had grown into a network of calculated resistance, each worker empowered to act in ways that ensured safety, solidarity, and dignity. Mira walked the grounds at dawn, her gaze sweeping over the fields and the quarters she had once occupied in silence. She noted the changes workers moving with confidence, a subtle alertness to their surroundings, a newfound ability to anticipate problems and solve them without interference. The plantation's hierarchy remained, but the unquestioned dominance of those who had inflicted cruelty had been carefully undermined. Mira had not relied on violence alone. She had relied on intellect, observation, patience, and the steadfast courage of those who had trusted her. The chest, now empty, sat at the edge of the courtyard. What had been a symbol of confinement and pain had transformed into a monument of resilience. Mira would return to it only as a reminder of her journey, the hardships endured, and the victories won through meticulous planning and unwavering resolve. Every scratch, every dent in its wood, told a story of survival, ingenuity, and quiet power. Outside the plantation, whispers began to spread, stories of the woman who had endured the chest, who had guided her fellow laborers without a single overt confrontation, who had orchestrated change from within, began to reach the surrounding estates. Some dismissed it as rumor, others watched with wary eyes, and a few saw the truth in the subtle shifts they themselves could not explain. Mira had proven that influence could be more formidable than brute force, that cunning and strategy could bend a system without breaking it violently, and that the human spirit, when determined, could endure even the most oppressive conditions. Mira herself moved with a quiet dignity, her posture a blend of strength and calm. She no longer needed to calculate every gesture to survive. The lessons of confinement had transformed into lessons of leadership. Those who once sought to dominate her learned, in small but profound ways, to respect the power of the unseen and the underestimated. The plantation was no longer merely a place of labor and suffering. It was a place where subtle change had begun, and where the seeds of autonomy had been carefully planted, ready to grow into something stronger, something enduring. As winter deepened, Mira gathered the people who had followed her, who had endured alongside her. They did not need speeches or declarations. The bond forged through shared struggle, patience, and strategy was enough. They moved together through the fields, attending to the work, but with an awareness that they were no longer entirely under the unseen yoke of fear. Mira's plan had reached its culmination: survival, guidance, and influence. The plantation remained a place of labor, yes, but it was also a testament to the human capacity for clever resistance, strategic foresight, and unwavering courage. In the silence of the final evening, Mira returned one last time to the chest. She traced her fingers along its edges, feeling the memories embedded in its wood, the fear, the endurance, the moments of triumph. She stepped back, satisfied, and walked away. The chest would remain, a relic of suffering transformed into resilience, but she would not. Mira's journey continued beyond those fences, beyond the fields, beyond the whispers of the overseers and the muted rumors of neighboring estates. Her spirit, her intellect, her strategy had endured. And as the stars began to shine overhead, one could almost imagine her smiling quietly, knowing that she had turned a symbol of oppression into a beacon of quiet, indomitable power. The plantation, once a place of unyielding fear, had changed forever. And in its transformation lay the testament of a woman who had endured the impossible, survived the unthinkable, and emerged not just as a survivor, but as a master of the unseen.